Arrogant police officer challenges a black judge's authority. What happens next is shocking. The sun was setting, painting the city streets in hues of orange and gold. Judge Olivia Carter drove calmly in her sedan, her thoughts occupied by the day's demanding schedule and the lingering exhaustion from back-to-back cases. As she approached a busy intersection, her gaze flicked to the rear-view mirror. A police cruiser appeared behind her, its red and blue lights flashing. She frowned slightly, glancing at her speedometer and noting she was well within the limit. Without hesitation, she signaled and pulled over to the side of the road. The police cruiser stopped directly behind her, its engine rumbling. Olivia rolled down her window and waited, her hands resting on the steering wheel. After a few moments, a uniformed officer stepped out, his heavy boots crunching against the gravel. His figure cast a long shadow under the fading light. "License and registration," he said curtly as he approached her window. Olivia complied without a word, retrieving her wallet and the vehicle's papers from the glove compartment. She handed them over, her expression neutral but attentive. The officer studied the documents, his lips curling into a slight smirk. "Do you know why I stopped you?" he asked, his tone carrying an edge. "No, officer," Olivia replied evenly. "I'm not aware of any infraction." The officer crossed his arms, tilting his head slightly. "You didn't come to a full stop back there at the sign. You just rolled through." Olivia's brows furrowed slightly. She was certain she had stopped, but her tone remained measured. "I see." The officer leaned closer to her window, his demeanor shifting to something more condescending. "Driving a nice car like this, huh? Bet you think the rules don't apply to you." Olivia met his gaze, her calm unbroken. "I wasn't aware that I had broken any rules, officer. If I did, I apologize." The officer's smirk widened. "Apologize? That's cute. People like you always think you can get away with anything. Flash a smile, say sorry, and expect a free pass." Olivia's grip on the steering wheel tightened slightly, but she didn't respond. The officer's gaze lingered on her, his tone dripping with authority. "Step out of the vehicle." Her eyes narrowed imperceptibly. "May I ask why that's necessary?" The officer raised an eyebrow, his smirk replaced by a glare. "Are you refusing a lawful order?" Without further hesitation, Olivia unbuckled her seatbelt and stepped out. She stood tall, her posture composed, as the officer gestured for her to move to the hood of her car. "Hands on the hood," he barked, his voice louder now. Olivia complied, her movements steady. A small crowd began to gather at a distance, curious about the scene unfolding. The officer circled her car, peering into the windows before opening the driver's door. He rummaged through her belongings without permission, his actions loud and deliberate. "What's this?" he asked, holding up a stack of papers. "Some kind of legal nonsense?" "Those are personal documents," Olivia replied calmly. "Please handle them with care." The officer laughed, tossing the papers back onto the passenger seat. "Care, huh? Don't worry, I've got this under control." He straightened, stepping closer to Olivia. "You think you're special, don't you? Driving around like you own the place. But let me tell you something. You're not above the law." Olivia remained silent, her gaze fixed ahead. The officer's words seemed to bounce off her calm exterior, though her presence alone exuded quiet strength. After a few tense moments, the officer waved dismissively. "Get back in your car. And next time, try following the rules." Olivia turned, her movements deliberate, and returned to the driver's seat. As she buckled her seatbelt, she glanced briefly at the officer. "Thank you, officer. Have a good evening." Her composed response caught him off guard. He hesitated for a moment, then walked back to his cruiser, shaking his head. As Olivia drove away, her face remained calm, but her mind churned with thoughts. In her rearview mirror, she saw the officer watching her leave, his smirk returning as he got back into his car. The evening sky deepened, and the city's noise faded as she continued down the road. The encounter lingered in the air, a moment charged with unspoken tension that neither of them would soon forget. The precinct buzzed with its usual energy. Phones rang, officers moved between desks, and the faint hum of a police scanner filled the air. Officer Greg Daniels leaned against the counter of the precinct's break room, recounting his evening to a small group of colleagues. His voice was loud, his tone dripping with confidence. "You should have seen her," Daniels began, gesturing animatedly. "Driving some fancy car, acting like she was untouchable. People like that think they can walk all over the rest of us." One of the officers, a younger recruit named Parker, frowned slightly but didn't interrupt. Daniels noticed and smirked. "What? You think I'm wrong?" Daniels challenged, his voice carrying just enough edge to silence any response. These types need a reminder of who's in charge. A little reality check never hurt anyone. Parker shifted uncomfortably but nodded. Another officer chuckled softly, clearly uninterested in picking a fight with Daniels, whose reputation for arrogance often discouraged disagreement. "What happened after?" an older officer asked, leaning back in his chair with a tired expression. "She folded," Daniels said with a grin, crossing his arms. "Didn't even try to argue. Guess she knew better." He shrugged, as if the incident were nothing, but his mind lingered on the encounter. There had been something about the woman's calmness that unsettled him. Most people he pulled over either got angry or flustered, but she had been neither. It was as if she had been waiting, watching. Daniels pushed the thought aside, dismissing it as unimportant. Anyway, one less entitled driver out there thinking they're above the law. Later that day, Daniels was called into the captain's office. Captain Miller was a seasoned officer with a reputation for running a tight ship. His office was orderly, with commendations on the wall and stacks of neatly organized files on his desk. "Daniels, sit," Miller said, gesturing to the chair across from him. Daniels complied, his confidence still intact. Miller leaned forward, his expression serious. "Heard about your traffic stop last night." Daniels raised an eyebrow. "Didn't think it was a big deal, Captain. Just another routine stop." Miller's jaw tightened slightly. "You don't think making someone step out of their car and searching it without cause is a big deal?" Daniels shrugged. "She was acting like she had something to hide." Miller sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. "Greg, we've had this conversation before. You don't escalate unless it's absolutely necessary. We've got enough eyes on us as it is. Last thing we need is someone filing a complaint and stirring up trouble." Daniels leaned back, his smirk returning. "With all due respect, Captain, I handled it. She didn't say a word. Just got back in her car and left." Miller's eyes narrowed. "You don't know that. People like that don't let things go quietly. Mark my words, this won't be the last we hear of it. Watch yourself." "Daniels, I mean it." Daniels nodded, feigning agreement. But as he left the office, his annoyance grew. To him, the captain's warnings were overblown. He had done nothing wrong, just his job. He couldn't understand why everyone was so sensitive about it. That evening, Daniel sat alone at a bar near the precinct. The usual clinking of glasses and murmurs of conversation surrounded him, but his thoughts were elsewhere. The woman's calm, unshaken demeanor replayed in his mind. He had expected fear or anger, but her composure had thrown him off. He swirled the whiskey in his glass, trying to shake the feeling. "What's her deal anyway?" he muttered to himself. The bartender glanced at him briefly but said nothing. Daniels took another sip, his confidence creeping back. "Doesn't matter," he thought. "She's just another civilian who needed to be reminded of the rules." But as he walked back to his car under the dim glow of the streetlights, that lingering unease refused to leave him. It was a feeling he couldn't quite place, a sense that the encounter wasn't over, even if he thought it should be. Daniels returned home, his bravado intact but his thoughts unsettled. Meanwhile, the calm presence of the woman he had dismissed so easily loomed larger in his mind. Unbeknownst to him, the wheels of consequence were already beginning to turn, and his actions were about to catch up with him in ways he could never anticipate. The morning sun bathed the courthouse in a golden hue as Judge Olivia Carter arrived for what she thought would be a routine day. Her mind was focused on the cases scheduled, her demeanor as composed as ever. The courthouse buzzed with its usual energy, lawyers carrying stacks of papers, defendants waiting anxiously, and clerks rushing to prepare documents. As Olivia reviewed the docket in her chambers, a particular case caught her attention. It involved an excessive use of force claim against a police officer during a traffic stop. She noted the defendant's name, Officer Greg Daniels. Her expression didn't change, but the name lingered in her mind. She closed the docket, gathered her notes, and prepared to enter the courtroom. By the time Olivia took her seat at the bench, the courtroom was already filled. The plaintiff, a middle-aged man dressed in business attire, sat quietly with his lawyer. On the other side of the room, Officer Daniels occupied the defendant's table, leaning back in his chair with a casual air. His lawyer sat beside him, flipping through case files. The room fell silent as Olivia entered. She scanned the crowd briefly, her gaze stopping on Daniels for a fleeting moment. His confident demeanor faltered for a second, but he quickly recovered, brushing it off as coincidence. Surely, she couldn't be the same woman he had pulled over. "Court is now in session," Olivia announced, her voice calm but commanding. "We are here to hear the case of Wallace versus Daniels. Plaintiff's counsel, you may proceed." The plaintiff's lawyer stood, adjusting their glasses before addressing the room. "Your Honor, this case is about the abuse of authority. My client, Mr. Wallace, was pulled over by Officer Daniels under questionable circumstances. What began as a routine traffic stop escalated unnecessarily, culminating in an unwarranted search of my client's vehicle and inappropriate remarks made by the officer." Olivia listened attentively, her expression unreadable. Daniels shifted in his seat, his confidence starting to waver as the details of the case were laid out. The lawyer continued, detailing the psychological and emotional toll the incident had taken on their client. After the opening statements, Daniels was called to the stand. He walked stiffly to the witness box, his casual demeanor replaced by a faint unease. As he raised his right hand to take the oath, he avoided looking directly at Olivia. "Officer Daniels," the plaintiff's lawyer began, "can you explain why you conducted a search of Mr. Wallace's vehicle during this traffic stop?" Daniels cleared his throat. "The vehicle appeared suspicious," he said, his tone clipped. "I believed it was necessary to ensure there was no danger to the public." The lawyer pressed on. "Did you have probable cause to initiate the search?" Daniels hesitated, his grip tightening on the edges of the witness box. "I believe there was enough reason to suspect." "Officer," the lawyer interrupted, "please answer the question directly. Did you or did you not have probable cause?" Daniels's jaw tightened. "No," he admitted reluctantly. The room murmured, and Olivia rapped her gavel lightly. "Order in the court," she said, her voice steady. She turned her gaze to Daniels. "Please continue, officer." Daniels felt the weight of her attention and stumbled over his next words. I acted based on my training and judgment at the time." The lawyer stepped closer, their voice firm. "And did your judgment also include making inappropriate comments about Mr. Wallace's appearance and demeanor?" Daniels's face reddened. "I don't recall making any inappropriate remarks." The lawyer raised an eyebrow. "You don't recall or you didn't?" After Daniels's testimony, Olivia addressed him directly. "Officer Daniels, you stated that you acted based on your training. Is it part of your training to conduct searches without probable cause?" Daniels opened his mouth to respond but hesitated, realizing the trap laid before him. "No, Your Honor," he said finally. Olivia nodded, her tone even but pointed. "Then it seems there is a gap between your training and your actions." This court takes such gaps very seriously. Daniels swallowed hard, his previous confidence now fully eroded. Olivia didn't dwell on the moment but moved on with a smooth professionalism that left the room hanging on her every word. As the session adjourned, Daniels returned to his seat, his mind racing. The composed, unshaken presence of Judge Carter loomed large in his thoughts. He couldn't shake the feeling that she knew more than she was letting on, and for the first time in his career, he felt the cracks in his authority. Meanwhile, Olivia returned to her chambers, her face calm but her mind active. The encounter in court had only solidified her resolve to see the case through, though the weight of its implications began to settle on her shoulders. The seeds of unraveling had been planted, and the courtroom tension hinted at battles yet to come. The courtroom was quieter than usual the following day, the weight of the case palpable among those in attendance. Judge Olivia Carter entered promptly, her calm authority filling the room as she took her place on the bench. The case involving Officer Daniels had quickly become a focal point, with whispers about the courtroom showdown circulating through the courthouse. Daniels sat at the defendant's table, his once cocky demeanor subdued. His lawyer whispered something in his ear, but Daniels barely acknowledged it, his gaze fixed forward. Olivia noticed his unease but gave no outward reaction. The plaintiff's lawyer called their next witness, a bystander who had witnessed Daniels's behavior during the traffic stop. The man was a middle-aged store clerk who had been standing outside his shop when the incident occurred. "Please state your name for the court," the lawyer began. "James Peterson," the man replied, adjusting his glasses. "Mr. Peterson, can you describe what you observed on the day in question?" Peterson cleared his throat, his voice steady. "I saw Officer Daniels pull over a car at the corner near my store. At first, it seemed routine, but then I noticed him making the driver get out of the car. He searched the vehicle without asking any questions that I could hear." "And how did the driver react?" the lawyer asked. "She was calm," Peterson said, glancing toward Daniels. "Didn't argue or resist. But the officer, he seemed like he was trying to provoke her." Daniels shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his lawyer placing a hand on his arm to steady him. "In your opinion," the lawyer pressed, "did Officer Daniels's actions seem justified?" Peterson hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "No. It looked like he was just trying to show he was in charge." The room stirred slightly at his words, but Olivia rapped her gavel lightly. "Order in the court," she said firmly. "Please continue." The lawyer turned their attention back to Daniels. "Officer Daniels, would you like to respond to the witness's testimony?" Daniels stood slowly, his jaw tight. "With all due respect, Your Honor, the witness doesn't know the full story. I acted based on what I observed at the time. It's easy to judge from the sidelines." Olivia's gaze sharpened slightly. "Officer Daniels, you are here to provide clarity, not to dismiss the testimony of others. Please address the specifics." Daniels hesitated, glancing at his lawyer, who gave him a subtle nod to proceed. I may have acted more firmly than necessary, but it was never my intention to provoke or escalate the situation." "Firmly," the plaintiff's lawyer repeated, their tone skeptical. "Is that how you would describe your comments and actions during the stop?" Daniels's shoulders stiffened. "Yes. I did what I believed was appropriate at the time." Olivia leaned forward slightly, her voice calm but direct. "Officer Daniels, would you agree that appropriate actions must align with the law and established protocol?" Daniels's face reddened. "Yes, Your Honor." "Then let me remind you," Olivia continued, her tone measured, "that the law exists to ensure fairness and justice, not to serve as a tool for personal authority. This court expects every officer to remember that distinction." Her words were precise, delivered without raising her voice, yet they struck Daniels harder than any accusation. He lowered his gaze, his confidence eroding under her steady scrutiny. As the session adjourned for the day, Daniels stormed out of the courtroom, frustration evident in his every step. His lawyer hurried after him, trying to calm him down. "Greg, stop," the lawyer said firmly, grabbing his arm. "You're making it worse." Daniels turned, his voice low but seething. "She's trying to ruin me." "She's doing her job," the lawyer replied, "and you need to focus on doing yours. If you let her get under your skin, you're handing her the win." Daniels shook his head, his hands clenched into fists. "This isn't just about the case. There's something about her. I don't know what it is, but she's playing a bigger game." The lawyer sighed, clearly exhausted. "Then stop giving her ammunition. Stick to the facts and keep your emotions in check." Daniels didn't respond, his thoughts spinning as he walked away. Back in her chambers, Olivia sat at her desk, reviewing notes from the day's proceedings. Her calm exterior remained intact, but her mind was sharp and focused. She had handled countless cases like this, but something about this one felt different. The lines between law and power were always precarious, and this case seemed to embody that struggle more than most. She had seen the cracks in Daniels's facade and knew the fight ahead would only intensify. As she glanced out the window, the city lights twinkling in the distance, Olivia allowed herself a brief moment of reflection. Justice was never easy, and the truth often came at a cost. But she was determined to see this through, no matter how complicated it became. Danielle's unease grew as Olivia's composed yet unyielding authority continued to expose the flaws in his actions. The tension between them deepened, setting the stage for a confrontation that neither could fully anticipate. The balance of power was shifting, and both sides braced for the battles ahead. The precinct was unusually quiet as Officer Greg Daniels walked through its corridors the next morning. The usual camaraderie among officers felt strained, their conversations tapering off as he passed. Whispers followed him, subtle but undeniable, like smoke hinting at an unseen fire. Daniels tried to shake off the discomfort, but the events of the courtroom lingered in his mind. He headed toward his desk, only to be stopped by Captain Miller's booming voice from down the hall. "Daniels, my office. Now." The tone left no room for argument. Daniels turned on his heel, his jaw tightening as he made his way to the captain's office. Captain Miller sat behind his desk, his hands clasped tightly together. His face was lined with exhaustion, his usual gruff demeanor sharpened by frustration. He gestured for Daniels to sit. "We've got a problem, Daniels," Miller began, his voice low but firm. "That case you're wrapped up in? It's bigger than you think." Daniels crossed his arms, leaning back in the chair. "With all due respect, Captain, it's being blown out of proportion. I didn't do anything outside protocol." Miller's eyes narrowed. "Don't play that card with me. I've seen the reports. I've heard the testimonies. And I sat through your courtroom performance yesterday. Do you think this department can afford the kind of heat you're bringing down on us?" Danielle's expression darkened. "So that's it? You're going to throw me under the bus to save the department?" Miller's fist came down hard on the desk, rattling a stack of papers. "You brought this on yourself. Your arrogance, your inability to de-escalate. Do you know how bad this makes all of us look? This isn't about saving the department. It's about dealing with the consequences of your actions." Daniels clenched his fists, his face red. "So what's the plan? You want me to grovel in court, beg for forgiveness?" Miller leaned back, shaking his head. "No. The plan is for you to step back. Effective immediately, you're on administrative leave." Daniels shot out of his chair. "Administrative leave? Are you kidding me? You're taking me off the job because of one traffic stop." Miller's gaze was unyielding. "This isn't just about the traffic stop, Daniels. It's about how you handled it, and how you've handled yourself since. You think this is some kind of game, but it's not. You're a liability right now, and until this case is resolved, I can't have you out there representing this department." Danielle's voice rose. "This is bull, and you know it. I've been here for years, and this is how you treat me." Miller stood, his voice dropping dangerously low. "Watch yourself, Daniels. You're on thin ice as it is. Take the leave. Use it wisely. Because if this goes any further south, you'll be out for good." Daniels left the office, his steps heavy with anger. The stares of his colleagues burned into him as he made his way to his locker. He ripped his badge from his chest and slammed it onto the shelf, grabbing his personal belongings with shaking hands. As he walked out of the precinct, the weight of his suspension pressed down on him. His confidence, once unshakable, was now fractured. His thoughts raced, oscillating between anger at the system and disbelief that his actions had led to this. Outside, the courthouse steps were buzzing with reporters. Danielle's frustration flared when he spotted Judge Olivia Carter at the center of the commotion, speaking calmly to a group of journalists. Her composed demeanor only added fuel to his already raging fire. Unable to restrain himself, Daniels approached the group. A reporter noticed him first, their eyes widening as they recognized the officer at the center of the controversy. "Judge Carter," Daniels called out, his voice loud enough to cut through the chatter. The reporters turned, their pens and cameras poised for a story. Olivia turned to face him, her expression calm but alert. "Officer Daniels," she said evenly, "what can I do for you?" The presence of the reporters seemed to unnerve him, but his frustration pushed him forward. "Enjoying your time in the spotlight," he sneered. "Making sure everyone knows how righteous you are?" The reporters leaned in, capturing every word. Olivia remained composed, her tone unwavering. "Officer Daniels, I suggest you consider the implications of your words. This is not the appropriate setting for personal grievances." Daniels's jaw clenched. "Appropriate? You've been dragging my name through the mud, and now you want to lecture me about what's appropriate?" Olivia's gaze didn't waver. "Officer Daniels, I am addressing a matter brought to my courtroom. Nothing more, nothing less. If you have concerns, I suggest you raise them through the proper channels." The reporters scribbled furiously, their cameras snapping photos of the tense exchange. Daniels realized too late that his outburst had only added fuel to the fire. He turned sharply and walked away, his fists clenched at his sides. As Daniels drove home, the reality of his situation began to settle in. His arrogance, once a source of power, was now his greatest weakness. Meanwhile, Olivia returned to her chambers, unshaken by the encounter but aware that the tension between them was far from over. The stakes were rising, and the paths of judge and officer were destined to collide again. The courthouse was packed, the air charged with anticipation. The trial involving Officer Greg Daniels had garnered significant public attention, with media outlets covering the proceedings and activists rallying outside. Inside the courtroom, Judge Olivia Carter took her seat at the bench, her composed demeanor masking the undercurrent of tension surrounding the case. Daniels sat at the defense table, his lawyer whispering in his ear. His expression was tight, his usual confidence replaced by a simmering unease. Across the aisle, the plaintiff and their legal team prepared their arguments, their faces set with quiet determination. The plaintiff's attorney rose first, addressing the jury with measured authority. "This case," they began, "is about the abuse of power. It's about an officer who used his position to intimidate, humiliate, and violate the trust of a civilian during what should have been a routine traffic stop." They gestured toward the plaintiff, seated near the front. "My client, Mr. Wallace, is not the first to experience this. But today, we are here to ensure he is the last." The courtroom was silent as the attorney outlined the specifics of the case. The lack of probable cause, the unwarranted search, and the demeaning comments made by Daniels during the stop. Their words were clear and pointed, painting a picture of systemic abuse that went beyond a single incident. When it was the defense's turn, Daniels's lawyer stood, adopting a tone of calm authority. "This is not a case of abuse," they argued. "This is a case of an officer doing his job under difficult circumstances. Mistakes may have been made, but they were not malicious. Officer Daniels acted within his discretion to ensure public safety." The defense attempted to reframe the incident as a misunderstanding, emphasizing Daniels's years of service and dedication to his role. They sought to plant seeds of doubt, questioning the motivations behind the lawsuit and the reliability of the witnesses. The plaintiff's team called their first witness, Mr. Wallace, to the stand. He recounted the events of the traffic stop with a quiet but firm voice, his testimony painting a vivid picture of the encounter. "He made me feel like I wasn't even a person," Wallace said, his voice steady despite the emotional weight of his words. "Like I didn't matter. All I wanted was to get home to my family." The courtroom listened intently as Wallace described the fear and humiliation he felt, his words cutting through the air like a blade. Next, the plaintiff's team called James Peterson, the bystander who had witnessed the incident. Peterson's testimony corroborated Wallace's account, adding weight to the plaintiff's claims. "It wasn't just what he did," Peterson said, adjusting his glasses. "It was how he did it. He didn't just stop the car. He made sure everyone around knew who was in charge." The defense cross-examined both witnesses, attempting to poke holes in their credibility. They questioned Peterson's vantage point and suggested Wallace's account might be influenced by anger or misunderstanding. But both men held firm, their testimonies unwavering. Finally, Daniels was called to the stand. He walked stiffly to the witness box, raising his hand to take the oath. His lawyer nodded encouragingly as he sat down, but Daniels's unease was evident. "Officer Daniels," the plaintiff's attorney began, "can you explain why you decided to search Mr. Wallace's vehicle during this stop?" Daniels cleared his throat. I believe the situation warranted further investigation. The vehicle seemed suspicious, and I was acting in the interest of public safety. Suspicious? The attorney pressed. Can you clarify what you mean by that? Daniels hesitated, his grip tightening on the edges of the witness box. It was late, and the car was moving erratically. The attorney raised an eyebrow. Moving erratically? Was this noted in your report? Daniels's face reddened. No, it wasn't. So, Officer Daniels, the attorney continued, your decision to conduct a search was based entirely on your perception of the situation, with no documented evidence to support it? Daniels's jaw clenched. Yes, I made a judgment call. The attorney paused for effect before delivering their next question. Would you say this judgment call aligns with your training and established protocol? Daniels hesitated, his voice quieter now. Not entirely. Throughout the proceedings, Olivia remained impartial, her demeanor steady as she listened to the testimonies and arguments. But as Daniels spoke, she observed the cracks in his confidence, the subtle signs of a man grappling with the consequences of his actions. When the defense attempted to redirect, emphasizing Daniels's years of service and clean record, Olivia allowed them to proceed but kept a close watch on the jury's reactions. The weight of the case was beginning to shift, the scales tipping slowly but unmistakably. As the day's session concluded, Daniels returned to his seat, his mind racing. The trial was no longer just a legal battle. It was a public reckoning, and he could feel the walls closing in. Meanwhile, Olivia returned to her chambers, reflecting on the day's events. The trial was far from over, but the truth was beginning to emerge, piece by piece. The path ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. Justice would not come without a fight. The courtroom was filled with tension as the trial resumed the next morning. The case had reached a critical point, and both sides felt the pressure. The plaintiff's team had presented a strong case, but the defense wasn't ready to give up without a fight. Officer Greg Daniels sat rigid at the defense table, his unease barely concealed. Across the aisle, the plaintiff, Mr. Wallace, appeared calm yet resolute, his legal team prepared for what was to come. Daniels's lawyer called their first witness of the day, a fellow officer who had worked alongside Daniels for years. Officer Paul Mitchell took the stand, his demeanor confident but professional. The defense sought to use Mitchell's testimony to bolster Daniels's credibility, painting him as a dedicated officer with an exemplary record. Officer Mitchell, the defense lawyer began, you've worked with Officer Daniels for several years. How would you describe his conduct on the job? Mitchell nodded. Greg is one of the hardest working officers I know. He takes his responsibilities seriously and always puts public safety first. Have you ever observed him abusing his authority or acting outside protocol? Mitchell shook his head. Never. He's always been by the book. The defense lawyer smiled, turning to the jury. So, in your professional opinion, is Officer Daniels the type of person who would intentionally misuse his authority? Absolutely not, Mitchell replied firmly. When the plaintiff's lawyer rose for cross-examination, their approach was measured and precise. They began by establishing Mitchell's close relationship with Daniels, highlighting their years of working together. Officer Mitchell, the lawyer said, would you say you and Officer Daniels are friends? Mitchell hesitated slightly before answering. We're colleagues, yes. Colleagues who spend time together outside of work? Occasionally, Mitchell admitted, his tone less confident. The lawyer stepped closer, their voice calm but pointed. You testified that you've never observed Officer Daniels abusing his authority. But can you say with certainty that you've been present during every interaction he's had with civilians? Mitchell frowned. No, I can't say that. So, it's possible that Officer Daniels may have acted inappropriately during interactions where you weren't present? Mitchell shifted in his seat. I suppose it's possible, but it doesn't seem likely. The lawyer paused, allowing the tension to build before continuing. Officer Mitchell, would it surprise you to learn that multiple complaints of excessive force have been filed against Officer Daniels in the past 5 years? The courtroom stirred, and Mitchell's expression faltered. I wasn't aware of that. The plaintiff's lawyer nodded, their tone sharper now. And would it surprise you to learn that these complaints follow a pattern of behavior consistent with the incident involving my client? Mitchell's face reddened. I can't speak to that. No further questions, the lawyer said, returning to their seat. The plaintiff's team then introduced a series of complaints filed against Daniels over the years. While none had resulted in formal disciplinary action, the pattern was undeniable. Each complaint described a similar escalation of routine encounters, with Daniels displaying a tendency to assert his authority unnecessarily. The courtroom was silent as the complaints were read aloud, each one chipping away at Daniels's credibility. The jury's expressions ranged from skepticism to outright concern, and Daniels's lawyer struggled to regain control of the narrative. Daniels sat frozen, his mind racing as he listened to the allegations. He had always dismissed the complaints as minor nuisances, confident that his position would shield him from serious consequences. But now, with each piece of evidence laid bare, his arrogance began to crack. He glanced at the jury, their expressions heavy with judgment. His lawyer whispered urgently in his ear, but Daniels barely heard the words. The walls of the courtroom seemed to close in around him, the weight of his actions finally becoming inescapable. As the session drew to a close, Judge Olivia Carter addressed the court. Her tone was calm but carried a weight that demanded attention. The evidence presented today highlights the importance of accountability in positions of authority, she said, her gaze sweeping over the room. This court reminds all parties that justice is not about power, but about fairness and responsibility. Let us proceed with that principle in mind as we continue. Daniels avoided her gaze, but her words lingered in his mind. For the first time, he felt the full gravity of what lay ahead. The defense's strategy had begun to unravel, the weight of the evidence too significant to ignore. As Daniels left the courtroom, his usual confidence replaced by a growing sense of dread, the realization that he could no longer control the narrative began to sink in. Meanwhile, Olivia prepared for the next stage of the trial, knowing that the truth was slowly but surely coming to light. The trial's developments had become the talk of the city. News outlets ran headlines dissecting the case, and social media buzzed with discussions about Officer Greg Daniels, Judge Olivia Carter, and the broader implications of the proceedings. Outside the courthouse, the crowd of protesters had grown, their signs and chants demanding justice. Naomi Harris, a local activist, stood near the courthouse steps with a megaphone in hand. Her voice rang out over the crowd. "This isn't just about one officer or one case," she declared, her tone impassioned. "This is about a system that has allowed abuse of power to go unchecked for far too long. Today, we're demanding accountability, not just for Greg Daniels, but for everyone who thinks their badge makes them untouchable." The crowd erupted into cheers, their energy electrified by her words. Signs reading "Justice for All" and "No Badge Above the Law" swayed in unison as the chants grew louder. Inside, the noise was faint but present. The courthouse staff moved briskly, their faces reflecting the tension of the day. Judge Olivia Carter, seated in her chambers, could hear the distant hum of the protest as she reviewed the case notes. Her expression remained composed, but the weight of the moment was clear. Meanwhile, Daniel sat alone in his apartment, the blinds drawn to block out the world outside. His phone buzzed incessantly with messages, some from supportive colleagues, others from angry strangers who had seen his name plastered across the news. He ignored them all. The TV was on in the background, a news anchor summarizing the trial's events. Officer Greg Daniels, accused of misconduct during a traffic stop, faces mounting evidence against him, including testimony from witnesses and a pattern of complaints over the years. The case has sparked a broader conversation about police accountability and systemic reform. Daniels grabbed the remote and turned off the TV with a frustrated growl. His world was unraveling, and the pressure was suffocating. He thought back to the trial, to Judge Carter's piercing gaze and the jury's judgmental stares. For the first time, he felt truly exposed. In her chambers, Olivia paused her work to glance out the window. The protesters below were a stark reminder of the stakes involved. The case was no longer just about Daniels and his actions. It had become a symbol for something far greater. She knew the responsibility on her shoulders was immense. There was a knock at the door, and her clerk entered with a stack of documents. "Your Honor, these just came in from the plaintiff's team. They're requesting additional time to introduce new evidence." Olivia nodded, taking the documents. Thank you, Sarah. I'll review these immediately. As the clerk left, Olivia turned back to her desk. The trial had taken on a life of its own, but she remained steadfast. Her role was to guide the proceedings with fairness and integrity, no matter how heated things became. Later that evening, Daniels ventured out to a convenience store, hoping to clear his mind. As he approached the counter, he noticed two men whispering nearby. They glanced at him, their expressions unreadable, before returning to their conversation. "That's him," one of them muttered, loud enough for Daniels to hear. Daniels's jaw tightened. He grabbed his items and headed for the door, but one of the men stepped forward. "Hey," the man said, his tone challenging. "You're that cop, right? The one who's been all over the news." Daniels turned slowly, his face hardening. "What's it to you?" The man shrugged, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Just wondering what it feels like to finally get a taste of your own medicine." The tension in the air was thick, and Daniels felt the familiar sting of anger rising. But he held back, recognizing that any outburst would only make things worse. Without another word, he turned and left the store, the man's mocking laughter echoing behind him. As Daniels drove home, the weight of his actions, and their consequences, pressed down on him like never before. The world outside was changing, and the trial had become a flashpoint for broader demands for justice. Meanwhile, Olivia prepared for the next day, knowing that the trial was reaching a critical juncture. Both of their worlds were moving toward an inevitable collision, and the outcome remained uncertain. The courtroom was quieter than usual as the trial resumed. The tension that had been building throughout the case was palpable, and all eyes were on the plaintiff's lawyer as they prepared to introduce new evidence. Judge Olivia Carter entered promptly, her calm and steady presence commanding the room. Officer Greg Daniels sat at the defense table, his unease more visible with each passing moment. The plaintiff's lawyer approached the bench, holding a thick folder of documents. "Your Honor," they began, their tone steady, "we would like to present additional evidence that directly pertains to this case. These documents contain records of Officer Daniels's prior misconduct complaints and a series of emails that raise serious questions about the culture within his precinct." Daniels stiffened in his seat, his lawyer immediately objecting. "Your Honor, this is an attempt to smear my client's character. These complaints were never substantiated, and the emails have no direct connection to this case." Olivia raised a hand to silence the murmurs in the courtroom. "I'll review the documents and determine their relevance," she said, her voice measured. She signaled for a brief recess, and the courtroom emptied while she examined the evidence. Back in her chambers, Olivia carefully read through the documents. The complaints against Daniels painted a troubling picture: repeated accusations of excessive force, racial profiling, and demeaning behavior. While the complaints had been dismissed due to lack of evidence or procedural errors, the pattern was undeniable. But it was the emails that caught her attention. They revealed a culture within the precinct that tolerated, if not encouraged, aggressive policing tactics. Several of the messages, sent by Daniels and his colleagues, included language that was not only unprofessional but disturbingly dismissive of civilian rights. Olivia leaned back in her chair, her face calm but her mind racing. The implications of this evidence went beyond Daniels. It pointed to systemic issues that could no longer be ignored. When the court reconvened, Olivia addressed the room with her usual authority. After reviewing the evidence, she said, "I have determined that it is both relevant and admissible. The jury will be permitted to consider this information as part of their deliberations." The plaintiff's lawyer wasted no time, presenting the complaints and emails to the jury. They highlighted the pattern of behavior, emphasizing how it aligned with the incident involving Mr. Wallace. "This isn't an isolated case," the lawyer argued. "It's part of a larger issue, a culture that allows officers like Greg Daniels to act without accountability." The jury listened intently, their expressions growing more serious with each piece of evidence. Daniels shifted uncomfortably, his lawyer whispering urgently in his ear. During the recess, Daniels retreated to a quiet corner of the courthouse. His lawyer approached, their frustration evident. "Greg, this is bad," they said bluntly. "We're losing the jury, and this new evidence makes it almost impossible to recover." Daniels's fists clenched. "They're dragging my name through the mud over nothing." Those emails, they were jokes. Everyone does it. His lawyers shook their head. Not everyone has a courtroom full of people dissecting their every word. You need to understand that this isn't just about you anymore. It's about what you represent. Daniels glared at the floor, his anger boiling beneath the surface. What I represent? I'm just doing my job. The lawyer sighed. Not according to them, Greg. And if we don't find a way to turn this around, it's going to cost you everything. As the day's proceedings ended, Olivia returned to her chambers. She sat at her desk, her fingers steepled as she considered the evidence and its implications. This trial was no longer just about Officer Daniels and Mr. Wallace. It was about the integrity of the justice system itself. Olivia knew the case had the potential to ignite change, but it would also draw scrutiny and resistance. Still, she was determined to see it through. The truth demanded it. The trial had taken a decisive turn, with the new evidence casting a harsh light on Daniels and the precinct he represented. The jury's growing skepticism mirrored the shifting tide of public opinion. As Daniels grappled with the crumbling defense, Olivia prepared for the challenges ahead, knowing the truth was slowly but surely coming to light. The courtroom was filled to capacity as the trial resumed the next morning. The weight of the previous day's revelations hung heavily over everyone present. Officer Greg Daniels sat at the defense table, his jaw clenched and his hands tightly folded. His once cocky demeanor had been replaced by a simmering unease. Across the aisle, the plaintiff, Mr. Wallace, appeared composed, bolstered by the mounting evidence. Judge Olivia Carter entered promptly, her presence commanding immediate silence. She surveyed the room briefly before taking her seat at the bench. The day promised to be pivotal, with the jury's perception increasingly shifting against Daniels. Daniels's lawyer stood to address the court, their tone clipped but determined. Your Honor, while the evidence presented yesterday has cast doubt on my client's character, I intend to prove today that the specific events of the traffic stop in question were lawful and justified. Olivia gave a curt nod, signaling for the proceedings to continue. The defense called their expert witness, a retired police captain with decades of experience, to provide context for Daniels's actions. In high-pressure situations, the captain explained, officers are trained to act decisively. While it's easy to judge in hindsight, the reality is that these split-second decisions often prioritize safety over protocol. The defense pressed the captain further, attempting to paint Daniels's actions as an overzealous but understandable response to perceived danger. They emphasized that his intent was not malicious but rooted in a desire to ensure public safety. The jury listened, their expressions mixed. While some appeared to consider the argument, others remained skeptical, their focus still lingering on the damning evidence from the previous day. When the plaintiff's lawyer cross-examined the expert witness, their approach was calm but incisive. Captain, they began, you mentioned that officers must act decisively in high-pressure situations. Can you confirm whether a routine traffic stop constitutes such a situation? The captain hesitated. Not typically, no. The lawyer stepped closer. And would you agree that conducting a search without probable cause, during a routine traffic stop, falls outside the bounds of standard protocol? The captain frowned. In most cases, yes. The lawyer nodded, their tone sharpening. So, given the circumstances of this case, would you say Officer Daniels's actions were a deviation from standard procedure? The captain shifted uncomfortably. I can't speak to his mindset at the time, but based on the evidence presented, it does appear he deviated from protocol. The plaintiff's lawyer turned to the jury, letting the statement hang in the air before returning to their seat. As the day progressed, the jury's attention became increasingly focused on Daniels himself. Every time he shifted in his seat or whispered to his lawyer, their eyes followed. His visible discomfort seemed to underscore the plaintiff's narrative, further eroding any remaining goodwill. Meanwhile, outside the courthouse, the protests grew louder. Activists waved signs demanding accountability, their chants audible even within the courtroom walls. The city was watching, and the stakes had never been higher. During a brief recess, Daniel stepped outside the courtroom to collect himself. The whispers and stares of the crowd followed him, a constant reminder of his crumbling reputation. As he stood by a water fountain, one of his colleagues approached. "Tough day, huh?" the officer said, his tone neutral. Daniels glanced at him, his expression hard. "You here to rub it in?" The officer shook his head. "No. Just thought you might need someone to talk to." Daniels scoffed. "Talk? What's there to talk about? They've already decided I'm guilty." His colleague hesitated, then said quietly, "Maybe it's time to own up, Greg. This whole badge gives me power thing. It's not working anymore." Daniels stared at him, anger flickering in his eyes. "I don't need advice from someone who doesn't understand what it's like out there." The officer sighed, stepping back. "Suit yourself. But if you keep acting like you've got nothing to answer for, you're only making it worse." Back in her chambers, Olivia took a moment to reflect on the day's proceedings. The defense's attempts to sway the jury had fallen flat, but she knew the trial was far from over. The case wasn't just about Officer Daniels and Mr. Wallace. It was a reflection of the broader issues of accountability and power within the justice system. She glanced at the file on her desk, containing the notes and evidence that had accumulated over the trial. Each piece told a story, and together, they painted a picture that couldn't be ignored. Olivia knew her role was to guide the trial with fairness, but the weight of its implications wasn't lost on her. As the court adjourned for the day, Daniels left with a heavy heart, his confidence now hanging by a thread. Outside, the protests roared louder, and the eyes of the city remained fixed on the courtroom. Inside, Olivia prepared for what lay ahead, knowing the trial's most critical moments were yet to come. The threads of the story were tightening, and the sense of an inevitable collision grew stronger with each passing day. The courtroom was quieter than usual as the trial entered its 11th day. The weight of the case had taken its toll on everyone involved. The jury, now visibly fatigued, filed into their seats, their faces a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. Officer Greg Daniels sat at the defense table, his posture rigid, his gaze fixed straight ahead. Across the aisle, the plaintiff's team seemed more focused than ever. Judge Olivia Carter took her seat at the bench, her expression calm but her eyes keen. The trial had reached a delicate point, and tensions ran high. Yet beneath the surface, forces outside the courtroom were beginning to stir. Daniels's lawyer took to the floor, their voice firm but edged with urgency. "Your Honor, we request the court to consider Officer Daniels's exemplary record before this incident. He has served the community diligently for years, and this single accusation does not define his career." They presented character testimonials from colleagues and supervisors, emphasizing Daniels's commitment to his role and his contributions to the precinct. Officer Daniels's actions may have been misunderstood, the lawyer argued, but they were never malicious. He acted in the interest of public safety, and his years of service should not be overshadowed by this one event. The jury listened, some nodding slightly, while others appeared unmoved. Daniels sat silently, his hands clenched beneath the table. The plaintiff's lawyer stood in response, their tone measured but unyielding. "Your Honor, while we acknowledge Officer Daniels's years of service, it is precisely because of his position that his actions warrant scrutiny. With authority comes responsibility, and when that responsibility is abused, it erodes the trust of the community." They pivoted to the emails introduced earlier in the trial, reminding the court of the culture of complacency within the precinct. "This case is not just about one man," they said, turning to the jury. "It's about ensuring that no one, no matter their title or position, is above the law." As the day's session ended and the courtroom emptied, Olivia returned to her chambers. She had just settled into her chair when her clerk entered, her expression unusually tense. "Your Honor," the clerk began hesitantly, "there's something you need to see." She handed Olivia an unmarked envelope. Inside were several pages of documents and a handwritten note. The documents were internal memos from the precinct, communications that hadn't been submitted as evidence. The memos detailed efforts by certain officers to suppress complaints against Daniels and others, revealing a network of corruption designed to protect their own. The note was short but chilling: "Stay in your lane, or face the consequences." Olivia's expression remained calm, but a flicker of concern crossed her eyes. She placed the documents on her desk, her mind racing. The implications of the memos were enormous, not just for the trial but for the entire precinct. And the note suggested someone wasn't pleased with how things were unfolding. Meanwhile, Daniels sat in his car in the courthouse parking lot, staring blankly at the steering wheel. His lawyer's words echoed in his mind, but they offered little comfort. The trial wasn't going his way, and the mounting evidence felt like a tidal wave he couldn't outrun. A knock on his window startled him. He looked up to see a fellow officer, one he recognized as part of his precinct's inner circle. Daniels rolled down the window cautiously. "Greg, we need to talk," the officer said, his tone low. Daniels frowned. "What is it?" The officer glanced around before leaning in. "This trial is getting messy. There are people upstairs who aren't happy. You need to make sure it doesn't get any worse." Daniels's unease deepened. "What are you talking about? It's not like I'm in control of this." The officer's expression hardened. "Just remember who's had your back all these years. Don't forget where your loyalty lies." Without another word, the officer stepped back and disappeared into the crowd. Daniels sat frozen, his mind racing. For the first time, he realized that the forces protecting him might turn against him if the trial didn't go their way. As Olivia reviewed the memos in her chambers, the weight of their implications pressed down on her. She knew the risks of pursuing the truth but remained resolute. Meanwhile, Daniels grappled with the growing realization that the system he had relied on to shield him was beginning to crumble. The trial had taken on a life of its own, and the threads of power, corruption, and accountability were tightening, leading all involved closer to an inevitable reckoning. The courtroom was silent as Judge Olivia Carter took her seat at the bench. The trial had entered its most critical phase, with tensions running high and both sides preparing for their final moves. Yet, unseen by many in the room, a storm was brewing behind the scenes, one that threatened to overshadow the case itself. The plaintiff's lawyer rose to address the court, their tone calm but charged with urgency. "Your Honor, members of the jury," they began, "today we present the final pieces of evidence that will clarify the events surrounding this case. This evidence not only speaks to Officer Daniels's actions, but to a culture within the precinct that prioritizes protection of authority over accountability." They introduced a series of documents, a combination of the complaints against Daniels and newly uncovered internal memos. The jury listened intently as the lawyer explained how the memos revealed deliberate efforts to suppress misconduct allegations within the precinct. "This is not a case of one bad decision or one bad actor," the lawyer continued. "This is a systemic issue, and Officer Daniels is both a product and a perpetuator of that system." The courtroom murmured, and Daniels shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his lawyer whispering urgently in his ear. The defense rose immediately after, their strategy pivoting toward damage control. "Your Honor, we object to the introduction of these memos on the grounds that they are unsubstantiated and were not obtained through proper legal channels," Daniels's lawyer argued. Olivia studied the documents carefully, her face impassive. Finally, she responded. "The court will allow this evidence to be considered," she said. "The jury may weigh its significance as part of their deliberations." The defense lawyer's shoulders slumped slightly, but they quickly regained their composure. Turning to the jury, they attempted to minimize the impact of the new evidence. "While these memos paint a troubling picture," they said, "it is important to remember that Officer Daniels is on trial for his specific actions during a single incident. Let us not lose sight of the facts amidst speculation about broader issues." As the session adjourned for lunch, Olivia returned to her chambers. She had barely sat down when her clerk entered, her face pale. "Your Honor, I think you should see this," the clerk said, handing over an envelope. Olivia opened it to find a second handwritten note. "This one more direct. Drop this case, or you'll regret it." Olivia's expression didn't change, but her mind raced. The threat was no longer subtle. It was a clear warning. She carefully placed the note in her desk drawer and locked it, determined not to let fear dictate her actions. Unbeknownst to Olivia, Daniels was also feeling the pressure. Back at the courthouse cafeteria, he sat alone, replaying his colleague's cryptic words from the previous day. The realization hit him like a cold wave. The system that had protected him for years would not hesitate to sacrifice him if it meant preserving its own image. When the trial resumed, the plaintiff's lawyer called their final witness, a former precinct officer who had resigned after witnessing the corruption firsthand. The witness was nervous but resolute as they took the stand. "I worked alongside Officer Daniels for several years," the witness began, their voice steady. And while I respected many of my colleagues, there was an unspoken rule. You protect your own, no matter what. The jury leaned forward as the witness described incidents where complaints against officers were ignored, evidence was altered, and victims were dismissed. The system isn't built for accountability, the witness concluded. It's built to protect those in power. Danielle's lawyer objected, claiming the testimony was irrelevant to the specific case. But the damage had been done. The jury's expressions revealed a growing skepticism, not just of Daniels but of the culture he represented. After court adjourned for the day, Olivia summoned both legal teams to her chambers. Her tone was calm but firm as she addressed them. This case has revealed troubling patterns that extend beyond the incident in question, she said. I remind both sides that this trial is about seeking justice, not advancing agendas or evading accountability. The plaintiff's lawyer nodded, their resolve unwavering. Danielle's lawyer, however, appeared uneasy, their earlier confidence replaced by visible strain. As the lawyers filed out, Olivia sat alone in her chambers. The weight of the case pressed down on her, but she refused to let it break her. The truth was close, and she was determined to see it come to light, no matter the risks. The trial had reached a boiling point, with both sides feeling the pressure of the revelations and the stakes involved. Olivia and Daniels found themselves in the eye of the storm, each grappling with the forces swirling around them. The threads of power, corruption, and justice were tightening, and the path forward promised no easy resolution. The courtroom was packed, the tension almost tangible as the trial reached its most crucial phase. Judge Olivia Carter entered, her expression composed but focused. The weight of the trial had become heavier with each passing day, but Olivia's resolve remained unwavering. She glanced briefly at the jury, whose fatigue was clear but whose attention was sharper than ever. Today promised revelations that could determine the trial's outcome. The plaintiff's lawyer approached the bench with a stack of documents and a USB drive. Your Honor, they began, we would like to submit our final piece of evidence. A series of recorded conversations between Officer Daniels and his colleagues, as well as additional internal memos corroborating the culture of misconduct within the precinct. Danielle's lawyer shot up, objecting immediately. Your Honor, this evidence was not submitted in discovery. We move to exclude it on the grounds of improper procedure. Olivia studied the documents and the USB drive for a moment before responding. The court will allow the evidence, she said firmly. The jury will decide its relevance and weight. The courtroom murmured as the plaintiff's lawyer plugged the USB drive into a laptop connected to the projector. The first recording played, the audio crackling slightly but clear enough to recognize Danielle's voice. We don't need probable cause if we make it look good, Daniels said, his tone flippant. These people don't know their rights half the time anyway. The jury's faces shifted, some with shock, others with quiet anger. Daniels sat frozen, his lawyer leaning in to whisper urgently, but he didn't respond. The next recording was even more damning. In it, Daniels joked with a colleague about escalating situations to assert dominance. Sometimes you've got to show them who's boss, he said, laughing. They step out of line, you put them back in place. The room was silent as the recordings ended. The plaintiff's lawyer turned to the jury. These recordings are not just words, they said. They reveal a mindset, a disregard for the law and the people Officer Daniels was sworn to protect. Danielle's lawyer rose to counter the impact of the evidence, but their arguments sounded hollow. While these recordings may paint my client in a negative light, they said, they do not prove that he acted maliciously during the incident in question. This trial is about facts, not perceptions. The jury's expressions suggested they weren't convinced. The recordings had cast a shadow over Danielle's defense that even the most skilled argument couldn't dispel. Daniels, meanwhile, sat with his head lowered, his confidence shattered. The cracks in his defense had widened into chasms, and he could feel the jury's judgment bearing down on him. As the plaintiff's lawyer prepared to wrap up their case, they delivered one final bombshell. Your Honor, we would like to call a surprise witness to the stand, they said. Former Sergeant Alan Monroe, who oversaw Officer Daniels during the time of the incident. The defense objected again, but Olivia allowed it. Monroe entered the courtroom, his posture stiff but his face resolute. He took the stand and swore the oath, his eyes scanning the room before settling on Daniels. Sergeant Monroe, the plaintiff's lawyer began, can you describe your role in the precinct during the time of the incident? I was responsible for supervising the officers on patrol, including Greg Daniels, Monroe replied. Were you aware of any complaints or concerns regarding Officer Daniels's conduct? Monroe hesitated before answering. Yes. There were multiple complaints, but they were often dismissed or buried. The courtroom stirred, and Monroe continued. The culture in the precinct was protective, to say the least. Complaints were seen as threats, not opportunities to improve. And officers like Daniels knew they had that shield. Daniels's face turned pale, his hands gripping the edge of the table. Monroe's testimony was a betrayal he hadn't anticipated. As Monroe stepped down, Olivia addressed the court. This case has brought forth serious allegations that extend beyond the immediate incident. I remind all parties that justice requires accountability, not just for individuals but for the systems that enable them. Her words resonated, the weight of the trial now pressing on everyone in the room. The jury's faces reflected the gravity of what they had heard, their decision looming closer. The trial had reached a crescendo, the revelations cutting through the defense like a blade. Daniels sat in silence, the reality of his actions and their consequences sinking in. Meanwhile, Olivia prepared for the final phase of the trial, knowing that the truth had finally come to light but that the hardest decisions still lay ahead. The atmosphere in the courtroom was suffocating as the trial neared its conclusion. Each moment felt heavier than the last, with both sides preparing for their final arguments. The evidence and testimonies presented over the past weeks had painted a stark picture, and the jury's faces reflected the gravity of the decisions they would soon have to make. Judge Olivia Carter entered, her presence commanding immediate silence. She took her seat, her gaze sweeping the room. Today would determine the trajectory of the trial, and the lives it had impacted. The plaintiff's lawyer rose, their tone measured but resolute. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, they began, this case is about more than a single incident. It's about accountability. Officer Daniels did not act in the interest of public safety during the traffic stop in question. He acted out of arrogance, disregarding the protocols and responsibilities that come with his badge. They gestured toward Mr. Wallace, who sat quietly at the plaintiff's table. My client came to this courtroom seeking justice, not just for himself, but for everyone who has ever felt powerless in the face of authority. The evidence is clear. The recordings, the testimonies, and the internal memos all point to a pattern of behavior that cannot be ignored. The lawyer's voice rose slightly, their passion evident. Officer Daniels violated the trust placed in him by his community. And when trust is broken, it must be addressed. It is now your responsibility to ensure that justice is served, not just for Mr. Wallace, but for the integrity of our system. The room was silent as the lawyer returned to their seat, their argument hanging heavily in the air. Daniels's lawyer stood next, their expression grim but determined. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, they began, while this trial has brought forth troubling evidence, I urge you to focus on the facts of this case. My client, Officer Daniels, made a judgment call during a routine traffic stop. Was it a mistake? Perhaps. But mistakes do not equal malice. They paused, letting the words sink in before continuing. Officer Daniels has served this community for years. He has put his life on the line to protect it. While the recordings and memos paint an unflattering picture, they do not prove that my client acted with intent to harm or oppress during the incident in question. The lawyer's tone softened as they addressed the jury directly. I ask you to consider the weight of your decision. This is a man's life, career, and reputation at stake. Do not let the noise surrounding this case distract you from the specific actions being judged here today. Returning to their seat, the defense lawyer cast a glance at Daniels, who sat stone-faced, his hands folded tightly on the table. As the jury was escorted out to begin their deliberations, the tension in the courtroom remained palpable. Olivia called for a recess, giving everyone a chance to breathe. But the air outside the courtroom was just as heavy, with reporters swarming the halls and activists chanting just beyond the courthouse doors. Daniels sat in a quiet corner of the courthouse, his thoughts a whirlwind. He replayed every decision, every word, every action that had led him here. For the first time, he felt the full weight of what he had done, and what it had cost him. Hours later, The jury returned. The courtroom fell silent as Olivia re-entered and took her seat. The foreperson stood, holding the verdict in their hands. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" Olivia asked, her voice calm but steady. "Yes, Your Honor," the foreperson replied. The courtroom held its collective breath as the verdict was read. Each word felt like a stone dropping into a still pond, rippling outward with immeasurable impact. As the verdict was announced, the courtroom erupted in emotion. For some, it was vindication. For others, it was devastation. Olivia remained composed, her mind already turning to the broader implications of the decision. The trial was over, but its echoes would resonate far beyond the walls of the courthouse. The courtroom was silent, every eye fixed on the jury foreperson as they unfolded the paper that held the verdict. Judge Olivia Carter sat poised at the bench, her calm exterior masking the tension she felt within. Officer Greg Daniels gripped the edges of the defense table, his knuckles white. Across the aisle, Mr. Wallace leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped tightly together. The foreperson cleared their throat, their voice steady but solemn. "In the case of Wallace versus Daniels, we, the jury, find the defendant." A pause. It stretched out, heavy with anticipation. "Liable for misconduct during the incident in question." The words hit like a thunderclap. A collective exhale rippled through the room, followed by murmurs and whispers. On the plaintiff's side, there was relief mixed with quiet vindication. Mr. Wallace closed his eyes briefly, his shoulders dropping as if a weight had been lifted. His lawyer placed a reassuring hand on his arm, a silent acknowledgement of the battle they had just won. On the defense side, Daniel sat motionless, his expression blank. His lawyer whispered something to him, but he didn't respond. The verdict echoed in his mind, each word striking with relentless force. Everything he had built, his career, his reputation, was crumbling before his eyes. Judge Carter rapped her gavel sharply, bringing the room back to order. "I remind everyone in this courtroom to maintain decorum," she said firmly. "This is a court of law, and the proceedings are not yet concluded." The plaintiff's lawyer rose, their tone respectful but firm. "Your Honor, given the jury's verdict, we request appropriate punitive measures to ensure accountability and to set a precedent against future misconduct." The defense lawyer stood in response, their voice edged with desperation. "Your Honor, while we respect the jury's decision, we urge the court to consider Officer Daniels's years of service and the contributions he has made to this community. Any punitive measures should reflect the context of his career, not just this single incident." Olivia listened intently, her expression unreadable. She nodded once and began speaking, her voice steady. "Officer Daniels," she said, addressing him directly, "this trial has revealed not just the actions you took during the incident in question, but a pattern of behavior that undermines the principles you were sworn to uphold. Accountability is not optional for those entrusted with authority. It is the foundation of justice." She paused, letting her words resonate. "The court orders that you forfeit your position within the police force effective immediately. Additionally, you will be subject to further investigation regarding the complaints brought to light during this trial. This court also imposes financial restitution to the plaintiff for damages incurred." The room stirred again, and Daniels's lawyer placed a hand on his shoulder in an attempt to steady him. Daniels's face was pale, his lips pressed tightly together. He felt the walls closing in, the weight of his downfall pressing on his chest. When the trial adjourned, the courthouse steps were flooded with reporters and protesters. Cheers erupted from the crowd as Mr. Wallace and his lawyer emerged. Cameras flashed, and microphones were thrust forward as questions poured in. "Mr. Wallace, how do you feel about the verdict? Do you think justice was served today?" Mr. Wallace paused, his expression thoughtful. "This isn't just about me," he said finally, his voice steady. "This is about accountability. It's about ensuring that no one is above the law. I hope this case sends a message. That change is possible, but only if we fight for it." Meanwhile, Daniel slipped out a side door, avoiding the media frenzy. He walked quickly to his car, his head low. The world outside seemed louder, harsher, as if it had turned against him entirely. He sat in the driver's seat for a long moment, staring at the steering wheel, the reality of his new life settling in. Back in her chambers, Olivia sat alone, the quiet a stark contrast to the chaos outside. She stared out the window, the city lights twinkling in the distance. The trial was over, but its implications stretched far beyond the courtroom. It was a reminder of the fragility of justice and the courage required to uphold it. For a moment, she allowed herself to feel the weight of what had transpired. Then, with a deep breath, she returned to her desk. There was still work to be done, and the fight for accountability was far from over. The morning after the verdict, the city buzzed with the echoes of the trial. News outlets splashed headlines across screens and newspapers. Officer Daniels found liable in landmark case. Judge Olivia Carter delivers verdict in misconduct trial, and accountability in law enforcement. A step forward. The courthouse steps, which had been a hub of protest and emotion, were now quiet, but the weight of the trial lingered in the air. Greg Daniels sat in his dimly lit apartment, the curtains drawn tightly shut. The verdict replayed in his mind like a relentless echo, each word cutting deeper than the last. His badge, once a symbol of authority and pride, lay on the coffee table, a stark reminder of everything he had lost. His phone buzzed incessantly, but he ignored it. Colleagues who once praised him now avoided his calls. Messages from friends were laced with pity or criticism. Social media was a minefield, filled with posts dissecting his every action and his downfall. Unable to bear the silence, he turned on the TV. The news anchor's voice was sharp and unrelenting. This trial has sparked national conversations about police accountability. Officer Greg Daniels, found liable for misconduct, faces further investigations into his pattern of behavior. Activists are calling for broader reforms in law enforcement to address systemic issues exposed during the trial. Daniels turned off the TV with a frustrated growl. He couldn't escape the consequences of his actions. Not in his apartment, not in the city, not even in his own mind. He stared at his phone, contemplating a call to the precinct, to someone, anyone, who might still support him. But deep down, he knew the system that once protected him had already moved on. He was a scapegoat now, a symbol of everything the precinct wanted to disavow. Miles away, Mr. Wallace sat on the porch of his modest home, his daughter playing in the yard. The sunlight bathed the scene in warmth, but his thoughts were heavy. The verdict had brought relief, but also a bittersweet realization. No court decision could undo the fear and humiliation he had endured. His lawyer had visited earlier that morning, delivering the first installment of the financial restitution ordered by the court. It was a significant amount, enough to ease his family's struggles, but Wallace's focus was elsewhere. "Daddy," his daughter called, running up to him with a smile. "Are you okay?" Wallace smiled softly, lifting her into his lap. "I'm okay, sweetheart. I'm just thinking." "About the bad man?" she asked innocently. Wallace paused, then shook his head. "No, not about him. I'm thinking about how we can make things better. For everyone." He hugged her tightly, vowing silently to use his experience to advocate for others who felt powerless. The trial had been a victory, but for Wallace, it was just the beginning of a larger fight for justice. Back at the courthouse, Judge Olivia Carter sat in her chambers, reviewing the final paperwork from the trial. The silence of the room was a stark contrast to the chaos of the past few weeks. The weight of the trial lingered, but there was a sense of resolution as well. Her clerk knocked softly on the door, entering with a cup of coffee. "Your Honor, the news is calling this trial a turning point," the clerk said with a small smile. "They're saying you've set a new standard for accountability." Olivia looked up, her expression thoughtful. "It's a step," she said, "but there's still so much more to do." The clerk nodded, placing the coffee on her desk. "If anyone can do it, it's you." As the clerk left, Olivia allowed herself a brief moment of pride. The trial had tested her resolve, but she had stayed true to her principles. Yet, she knew this was only one battle in a much larger war for systemic reform. She glanced at the drawer where the threatening notes were still locked away. The threats had been unnerving, but they hadn't deterred her. If anything, they had strengthened her determination to fight for justice, no matter the cost. At the precinct, Captain Miller sat in his office, his face drawn with stress. The trial had placed the department under a harsh spotlight, exposing its flaws to the entire city. Complaints about other officers had begun pouring in, and internal investigations were underway. Miller's phone rang, and he answered it reluctantly. "Yes, Chief," he said, his tone weary. The voice on the other end was sharp. "We need to clean house, Miller. This trial has exposed cracks we can't ignore. Start with Danielle's cases. Review every single one. If there's misconduct, we need to address it before it becomes another headline." Miller sighed. "Understood, Chief. We'll get it done." As he hung up, Miller leaned back in his chair, his thoughts heavy. The system he had spent decades upholding was finally being forced to reckon with its failures. And while part of him resented the scrutiny, another part knew it was long overdue. Outside the courthouse, the protests had evolved into organized efforts for change. Activists, including Naomi Harris, rallied community members to push for legislative reforms. Their chants of accountability for all echoed through the streets. Naomi stood at the forefront, her megaphone in hand. "This trial was a victory, but it's not the end," she shouted. "We will keep fighting until every voice is heard and every life is valued." The crowd roared in agreement, their energy electrified. For them, the trial was a symbol of hope, a sign that change was possible, even in the face of a flawed system. That night, Daniel sat alone in his apartment, staring at the city lights through the gap in his curtains. His phone buzzed with another call, but he didn't answer. The precinct had cut ties with him, his colleagues had turned their backs, and his name was synonymous with disgrace. For the first time, he allowed himself to confront the truth. His arrogance, his misuse of authority, his disregard for the people he had sworn to protect, it had all led to this. The system he once relied on had abandoned him, but he couldn't escape the realization that he had been the architect of his own downfall. He poured himself a drink, his hand trembling slightly. The weight of his actions and their consequences pressed down on him, leaving him to grapple with a reality he could no longer deny. The threads of the trial had unraveled, leaving behind a tapestry of accountability, reflection, and hope. For Daniels, it was the end of a career and the beginning of a harsh reckoning. For Wallace and the community, it was a step toward justice. And for Olivia, it was a reminder of the relentless pursuit required to uphold the principles of fairness and equality. But the fight was far from over. The trial had sparked a fire, a demand for change that would burn long after the courtroom lights were turned off. I ask you to please comment on your impressions and opinions in the comments. I would feel very happy if you leave me a like.